Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Lovecast 76. This one is all about, this whole series, in fact, it's all about one of my favorite musical and literary heroes, James Matthew Barrie. He wrote through a lot of his life, but he was born in 1860. He died in the worst part of the Great Depression. He died in 1937. But before we go into J.M. Barrie, let's just say hi to the folks in the chat. Hello, Angelica. Hello. Joe Warren. Hi. Christina Beelan. Darling. Dari Mills is here. Melissa Catano, Angelica Bolschweiler, hi. Susan Kuhn, Kathy B. My mom, Pam, is here. Zachary White, yeah. Emily Thatcher, hello, darling. You know what? So Emily's saying, I've been having a rough day, so I probably won't be in the chat much. I'll be watching and listening, though. I want any show that I do, to be a refuge, as opposed to something that you feel forced to contribute to. I want it to be something that you're happy to retreat to. So, Emily, darling, do whatever you need for self-care. We all love you. You are welcome and not obligated. Hi, Kelsey Blaine Gibson. Nick Davila. Hey, man. Hello. All right. I said hi to Joe Warren, didn't I? Did I? Maybe I will risk repeating someone as special as she. Hello or hello again. Okay. So, we have a lot of material to cover tonight. Oh dear, I shouldn't make it sound like a class or anything that you all are expected to keep up with. No, but I'm going to start with, good. Oh, hello, Amanda Benjamin. Excuse the noise while I mess with the mic. I can't drink tea over where I sound checked to, oh dear, messed that up. And to anyone that is curious, I'm drinking Earl Grey tonight because it doesn't get much more British than pt1. Let's see. So, Peter Pan. A lot of y'all know this from Disney and Disney Works. But this was written by J.M. Barrie. J.M. Barrie was a Scottish novelist and playwright. He was born and educated in Scotland, then moved to London, where he wrote a number of successful novels and plays. That's what you got to keep in mind about this guy. As an author, this guy was a playwright. He clearly envisioned, even if he was not writing an actual play, I think from a narrative and setting point of view, he tried as often as possible to think about things in terms of stage plays. But we will go on as to why this is exceptional in every form, including to him. So Barrie knew early on that he wished to follow a career as an author. However, his family attempted to persuade him to choose a profession such as the ministry. Just like Charles Darwin, by the way. Charles Darwin started out studying for the ministry and then got his formal education in geology. J.M. Barrie worked out a compromise where he would attend a university but would study literature, and then graduated from the University of Edinburgh in 1882. In London, Barrie moved in literary circles and had a lot of famous friends such as Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island, George Bernard Shaw, who wrote Pygmalion, and George was also just a very funny person. J.M. Barrie also founded that famous amateur cricket team for friends of similarly limited playing ability. It had partners such as Rudyard Kipling, Arthur Conan Doyle, P.G. Wodehouse, H.G. Wells, and friend to the show, A.A. Milne. Barrie and his wife, and by the way, that marriage was very unusual in the day because that marriage ended in a divorce. Barrie and his wife bought a house near Kensington Gardens. Barrie took to going out for long walks in London's Kensington Gardens with his Saint Bernard of the same name as Paul Carganilla's dog, Porthos. Yes, Paul Carganilla and J.M. Barrie have two things in common, which is the imaginative characters they've given birth to and a dog named Porthos. At the Gardens, J.M. Barrie met the 5 Llewyn Davies brothers in the late 1890s, and he found inspiration for his best-known work, Peter Pan, with the Davies family, and several of the characters were named after them. The character of Peter Pan was invented to entertain George and Jack. Barrie would say, to amuse them, that their little brother Peter could fly. He claimed that babies were birds before they were born. Parents put bars on nursery windows to keep the little ones from flying away. This grew into a tale of an ageless boy who did fly away. And let us, by the way, revisit that in the first chapter of the story when we start reading this, as to what Peter Pan's mythological responsibility to recently passed on children is. Just when we get to that bit, it's not in Barrie's text, it's not dark, and it seems like it should be, but it really isn't when you think about it that way. So Barrie unofficially adopted the Davies boys following the deaths of their parents. And although J.M. Barrie continued to write successfully, Peter Pan just overshadowed his other work. And this work is credited with popularizing the name Wendy. Hello, Joanne King. Charity Swanson. Hello, darling. Haven't seen you for a little while. Lovely to have you back. Just glancing back through the chat before we actually begin here. All right. I see Mom filling in of people into former things that Dad has written about Lydia Bunking and Kermit Plaid, both, yes. Hello, Terry Smith. It was lovely to see you for the first time literally in years. I went out to South Pasadena to hear the Delgado brothers on Saturday night this last weekend, and Terry Smith came, and I was not terribly surprised to hear that she was already planning on going to this outdoor concert in the park type thing. When I specifically messaged her, and she was like, "Oh yeah, you're gonna be there, and the Delgado brothers are playing. Oh hell yeah!" And we had a lovely evening catching up. It was the first meeting in like 2.5 years, give or take. So, Peter Pan, which was also titled Peter and Wendy. What I'm going to read to you tonight, this text matches the 1911 original publication. And this publication is in the public domain in the United States of America. Chapter 1. Peter breaks through. All children, except one, grow up. They soon know that they will grow up. And the way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth, Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. Of course, they lived at number 14, and until Wendy came, her mother was the chief one. She was a lovely lady with a romantic mind and such a sweet, mocking mouth. Her romantic mind was like the tiny boxes, one within the other, that come from the puzzling East. However many you discover, there's always one more, and her sweet, mocking mouth had one kiss on it that Wendy could never get, though there it was, perfectly conspicuous, in the right-hand corner. The way Mr. Darling won her was this. The many gentlemen who had been boys when she was a girl discovered simultaneously that they loved her, and they all ran to her house to propose to her, except Mr. Darling, who took a cab and nipped in first, and so he got her. He got all of her, except the innermost box and the kiss. He never knew about the box, and in time he gave up trying for the kiss. Wendy thought Napoleon could have got it, but I can picture him trying and then going off in a passion, slamming the door. Mr. Darling used to boast to Wendy that her mother not only loved him, but respected him. He was one of those deep ones who know about stocks and shares. Of course, no one really knows, but he quite seemed to know. And he often said stocks were up and shares were down in a way that would have made any woman respect him. Mrs. Darling was married in white, and at first she kept the books perfectly, almost gleefully, as if it were a game. Not so much as a Brussels sprout was missing, but by and by, whole cauliflowers dropped out, and instead of them, there were pictures of babies without faces. She drew them when she should have been totting up. They were Mrs. Darling's guesses. Wendy came first, then John, then Michael. For a week or two after Wendy came, it was doubtful whether they would be able to keep her, as she was another mouth to feed. Mr. Darling was frightfully proud of her, but he was very honorable, and he sat on the edge of Mrs. Darling's bed, holding her hand and calculating expenses while she looked at him imploringly. She wanted to risk it, come what might, but that was not his way. His way was with a pencil and a piece of paper. And if she confused him with suggestions, he had to begin at the beginning again. Now, don't interrupt, he would beg of her. I've £1.17 here. All right. I have £1.17 here. And 2 and 6 at the office. I can cut off my coffee at the office, say 10 shillings making 2 9 cents. With your 18 and 3 makes 397. With 5 not in my checkbook makes 897. Who is that moving? 897 dot and carry 7. Don't speak my own. Shh. And the pound you lent to that man who came to the door. Quiet, child. Dot and carry child. There. Now you've done it. Did I say 997? Yes, I said 997. The question is, can we try it for a year on 997? Of course we can, George, she cried. But she was prejudiced in Wendy's favor, and he was really the grander character of the two. Remember, Mumps, he warned her, almost threateningly, and off he went again. Mumps, £1. That is what I've put down, but I dare say it'll be more like 30 shillings. Don't speak! Measles, 1.5. German measles, half a guinea, makes 2.15.6. Don't waggle your finger. Shh. Whooping cough, say 15 shillings. And so on it went. And it added up differently each time, but at last, Wendy just got through, with mumps reduced to 12.6 and the 2 kinds of measles treated as 1. There was the same excitement over John, and Michael had even a narrower squeak. But both were kept, and soon you might have seen the 3 of them going in a row to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school, accompanied by their nurse. Mrs. Darling loved to have everything just so. And Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbors. So, of course, they had a nurse. As they were poor, owing to the amount of milk the children drank, this nurse was a prim Newfoundland dog called Nana, who had belonged to no one in particular until the Darlings engaged her. She had always thought children important, however, and the Darlings had become acquainted with her in Kensington Gardens, where she spent most of her spare time peeping into perambulators and was much hated by careless nursemaids whom she followed to their homes and complained of to their mistresses. She proved to be quite a treasure of a nurse. How thorough she was at bath time, and up at any moment of the night if one of her charges made the slightest cry. Of course, her kennel was in the nursery. She had a genius for knowing when a cough is a thing to have no patience with and when it needs a stocking around your throat. She believed to her last day in old-fashioned remedies like rhubarb leaf, and made sounds of contempt over all this new-fangled talk about germs and so on. It was a lesson in propriety to see her escorting the children to school, walking sedately by their side when they were well behaved, and butting them back into line if they strayed. On John's pedestrian days, she never once forgot his sweater, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of rain. There's a room in the basement of Miss Folsom's school where the nurses wait. They sat on forms while Nana lay on the floor, but that was the only difference. They affected to ignore her as if an inferior social status to themselves, and she despised them with their light talk. She resented visits to the nursery from Mrs. Darling's friends, but if they did come, she first whipped off Michael's pinafore and put him into the one with blue braiding, and smoothed out Wendy and made a dash at John's hair. No nursery could possibly have been conducted more correctly, and Mr. Darling knew it. Yet he sometimes wondered uneasily whether the neighbors talked. He had his position in the city to consider. Nana also troubled him in another way. He had sometimes a feeling that she did not admire him. "I know she admires you tremendously, George," Mrs. Darling would assure him, and then she would sign to the children to be especially nice to Father. Lovely dances followed, in which the only other servant, Liza, was sometimes allowed to join. Such a midget she looked in her long skirt and maid's cap. The gaiety of those romps, and gayest of all, was Mrs. Darling, who would pirouette so wildly that all you could see of her was the kiss. And then, if you had dashed at her, you might have got it. There never was a simpler, happier family. Until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for the next morning, repacking into their proper places the many articles that have wandered during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch her. It is quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you had picked this thing up, making discoveries sweet and not so sweet, pressing this into her cheek as if it were as nice as a kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake in the morning, the naughtiness and evil passions with which you went to bed have been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your mind, and on the top, beautifully aired, spread out for your prettier thoughts, ready for you to put on. I don't know whether you have ever seen a map of a person's mind. Doctors sometimes draw maps of other parts of you, and your own map can become intensely interesting, but catch them trying to draw a map of a child's mind, which is not only confused, but keeps going round all the time. There are zigzag lines on it, just like your temperature on a card. And these are probably roads in the island, for the Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of color here and there, and coral reefs, and rakish-looking craft in the offing, and savages, and lonely lairs, and gnomes who are mostly tailors, and caves through which a river runs, and a princess with 6 elder brothers, and a hut fast going to decay, and one very small old lady with a hooked nose. It would be an easy map if that were all. But There is also first day at school, fathers, the round pond, needlework, murders, hangings, chocolate pudding day, getting into braces, and so on. And either these are part of the island, or they are another map showing through. And it is all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. Of course, the Neverlands vary a good deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, at which John was shooting, while Michael, who was very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands, Michael in a wigwam, Wendy in a house of leaves, deftly sewn together. John had no friends. Michael had friends at night, and Wendy had a pet wolf, forsaken by its parents. But on the whole, the Neverlands have a family resemblance. On these magic shores, children at play are forever beaching their coracles. We too have been there. We can still hear the sound of the surf, though we shall land no more. Of all delectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact. Not large and sprawly, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and tablecloth, it is not in the least alarming. But in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very real. That is why there are nightlights. Occasionally, in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand. And of these, quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy's began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bolder letters than in any of the other words, and Mrs. Darling gazed. She felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. "Yes, he is rather cocky," Wendy admitted with regret. Her mother had been questioning her. "But who is he, my pet?" "He's Peter Pan, you know, Mother." At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she just remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were odd stories about him, as that when children died, he went part of the way with them, so that they should not be frightened. She had believed in him at the time, but now that she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. "Besides," she said to Wendy, "he would be grown up by this time." "Oh, no, he isn't grown up," Wendy assured her confidently, "and he's just my size." She meant that he was her size in both mind and body. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew it. Mrs. Darling consulted Mr. Darling, but he just smiled. "Mark my words," he said. "It is Some nonsense Nana has been putting into their heads. Just the sort of idea a dog would have. Leave it alone, leave it alone, it'll blow over. But it would not blow over. And soon, the troublesome boy gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without being troubled by them. For instance, they may remember to mention a week after the event happened that when they were in the wood, they had met their dead father and had a game with him. It was in this casual way that Wendy, one morning, made a disquieting revelation. Some leaves of a tree had been found on the nursery floor, which certainly were not there when the children went to bed, and Mrs. Darling was puzzling over them when Wendy said with a tolerant smile, "I do believe it was Peter again." "Whatever do you mean, Wendy?" "It's so naughty of him not to wipe his feet," Wendy said, sighing. She was a tidy child. She explained in quite a matter-of-fact way that she thought Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night and sat on the foot of her bed and played on his pipes to her. Unfortunately, she never woke, so she didn't know how she knew. She just knew. "What nonsense you talk, Precious. No one can come into the house without knocking. I think he comes in by the window," she said. "My love, it is 3 floors up." "Were not the leaves at the foot of the window, Mother?" It was quite true. The leaves had been found very near the window. Mrs. Darling did not know what to think, for it all seemed so natural to Wendy that you could not dismiss it by saying she had been dreaming. "My child," the mother cried, "why did you not tell me of this before?" "I forgot," said Wendy lightly. She was in a hurry to get to her breakfast. Surely she must have been dreaming. But, on the other hand, there were the leaves. Mrs. Darling examined them very carefully. They were skeleton leaves, but she was sure they did not come from any tree that grew in England. She crawled about on the floor, peering at it with a candle for marks of a strange foot. She rattled the poker up the chimney and tapped the walls. She let down a tape from the window to the pavement, and it was sheer drop of 30 feet without so much as a spout to climb up by. Certainly, Wendy had been dreaming. But Wendy had not been dreaming, as the very next night showed, the night on which the extraordinary adventures of these children may be said to have begun. On the night we speak of, all the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off, and Mrs. Darling had bathed them and sung to them, till one by one they had let go her hand and slid away into the land of sleep. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now and sat down tranquilly by the fire to sew. The fire was warm, however, and the nursery dimly lit by 3 nightlights, and presently the sewing lay on Miss Darling's lap. Then her head nodded, oh, so gracefully. She was asleep. Look at the 4 of them, Wendy and Michael over there, John here, and Mrs. Darling by the fire. There should have been a fourth nightlight. While she slept, she had a dream. She dreamt that the Neverland had come too near, and that a strange boy had broken through from it. He did not alarm her, for she thought she had seen him before in the faces of many women who have no children. Perhaps he is to be found in the faces of some mothers also. But in her dream, he had torn the film that obscures the Neverland, and she saw Wendy and John and Michael peeping through the gap. The dream by itself would have been a trifle, but while she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open, and a boy did drop on the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light, no bigger than your fist, which darted about the room like a living thing, and I think it must have been this light that wakened Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once that he was Peter Pan. If you or I or Wendy had been there, we should have seen that he was very like Miss Darling's kiss. He was a lovely boy clad in skeleton leaves and the juices that ooze out of trees. But the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all his first teeth. When he saw she was a grown-up, he gnashed those little pearls at her. Chapter 2. The Shadow. Mrs. Darling screamed, and as if in answer to a bell, the door opened and Nana returned from her evening out. She growled and sprang at the boy, who leapt lightly through the window. Again Mrs. Darling screamed, this time in distress for him, for she thought he was killed, and she ran down into the street to look for his little body, but it was not there. And she looked up, and in the black night she could see nothing but what she thought was a shooting star. She returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth, which proved to be the boy's shadow. As he leapt at the window, Nana had closed it quickly, too late to catch him, but his shadow had not had time to get out. Slam went the window and snapped it off. You may be sure Mrs. Darling examined the shadow carefully, but it was quite the ordinary kind. Nana had no doubt of what was the best thing to do with this shadow. She hung it out at the window, meaning, he's sure to come back for it. Let us put it where he can get it easily without disturbing the children. But, unfortunately, Mrs. Darling could not leave it hanging out at the window. It looked so like the washing and lowered the whole tone of the house. She thought of showing it to Mr. Darling, but he was tottering up in winter greatcoats for John and Michael, with a wet towel around his head to keep his brain clear, and it seemed a shame to trouble him. Besides, she knew exactly what he would say. It all comes of having a dog for a nurse. She decided to roll the shadow up and put it away carefully in a drawer until a fitting opportunity came for telling her husband. Me. The opportunity came a week later on that never-to-be-forgotten Friday. Of course it was a Friday. I ought to have been specially careful on a Friday, she used to say afterwards to her husband, while perhaps Nana was on the other side of her, holding her hand. No, Mr. Darling always said. I am responsible for it all. I, George Darling, did it. Mea culpa, mea culpa. He had had a classical education. They sat thus, night after night, recalling that fatal Friday till every detail of it was stamped on their brains and came through on the other side like the faces on a bad coinage. If only I'd not accepted that invitation to dine at 27. If only I'd not poured my medicine into Nana's bowl, said Mr. Darling.
If only I had pretended to like the medicine,
was what Nana's wet eye said.
My liking for parties, George.
My fatal gift of humor, dearest.
My touchiness about trifles, dear master and mistress.
Then one or more of them would break down altogether. Nana, at the thought,
It's true. They ought not to have had a dog for a nurse.
Many a time it was Mr. Darling who put the handkerchief to Nana's eyes. That fiend! Mr. Darling would cry, and Nana's bark was the echo of it. But Mrs. Darling never upbraided Peter. There was something in the right-hand corner of her mouth that wanted her not to call Peter names. They would sit there in the empty nursery, recalling fondly every smallest detail of that dreadful evening. It had begun so uneventfully, so precisely like 100 other evenings, with Nana putting on the water for Michael's bath and carrying him to it on her back. I won't go to bed, he had shouted, like one who still believed that he had the last word on the subject. I won't! Nana, it isn't 6 o'clock yet! Oh dear, I shan't love you any more, Nana. I tell you, I won't be bathed. I won't! Then Mrs. Darling had come in, wearing her white evening gown. She had dressed early because Wendy so loved to see her in her evening gown. With the necklace George had given her, she was wearing Wendy's bracelet on her arm. She had asked for the loan of it. Wendy loved to lend her bracelet to her mother. She had found her 2 older children playing at being herself and father on the occasion of Wendy's birth, and John was saying, I am happy to inform you, Mrs. Darling, that you are now a mother, in just such a tone as Mr. Darling himself may have used on the real occasion. Wendy had danced with joy, just as the real Mrs. Darling must have done. Then John was born, with the extra pomp that he conceived due to the birth of a male, and Michael came from his bath to ask to be born also, but John said brutally that they did not want any more. Michael had nearly cried, Nobody wants me, he said, and of course the lady in the evening dress could not stand that. I do, she said. I so want a 3rd child.
Boy or girl?
Asked Michael, not too hopefully. Boy. Then he had leapt into her arms. Such a little thing for Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana to recall now, but not so little if that was to be Michael's last night in the nursery. They go on with their recollections. It was then that I rushed in like a tornado, wasn't it? Mr. Darling would say, scorning himself, and indeed he had been like a tornado. Perhaps there was some excuse for him. He, too, had been dressing for the party, and all had gone well with him until he came to his tie. It is an astounding thing to have to tell, but this man, though he knew about stocks and shares, had no real mastery of his tie. Sometimes the thing yielded to him without a contest, but there were occasions when it would have been better for the house if he had swallowed his pride and used a made-up tie. This was such an occasion. He came rushing into the nursery with a crumpled little brute of a tie in his hand. What is the matter, father dear? Matter? He yelled. He really yelled. This tie, it will not tie. He became dangerously sarcastic. Not round my neck, round the bedpost. Oh, yes, 20 times have I made it up round the bedpost, but round my neck? No! Oh, dear, no! Begs to be excused. He thought Mrs. Darling was not sufficiently impressed, and he went on sternly. I warn you of this, mother, that unless this tie is round my neck, we don't go out to dinner tonight. And if I don't go out to dinner tonight, I never go to the office again. And if I don't go to the office again, you and I starve. Our children flung out into the streets. Even then, Mrs. Darling was placid. Let me try, dear, she said, and indeed, that was what he had come to ask her to do. And with her nice, cool hands, she tied his tie for him, while the children stood around to see their fate decided. Some men would have resented her being able to do it so easily, but Mr. Darling had far too fine a nature for that. He thanked her carelessly, at once forgot his rage, and in another moment was dancing round the room with Michael on his back. How wildly we romped, says Mrs. Darling, now recalling it. A lost romp, Mr. Darling groaned. Oh, George, do you remember Michael suddenly said to me, how did you get to know me, Mother? I remember. They were rather sweet, don't you think, George? And they were ours, and now they're gone. The romp had ended with the appearance of Nana, and most unluckily, Mr. Darling collided against her, covering his trousers with her hairs. They were not only new trousers, but they were the first he had ever had with a braid on them, and he had to bite his lip to prevent the tears coming. Of course, Mrs. Darling brushed him, but he began to talk again about its being a mistake to have a dog for a nurse. George, Nana is a treasure, no doubt, but I have an uneasy feeling at times that she looks upon the children as puppies. Oh, no, dear one, I feel sure she knows they are people. I wonder, Mr. Darling said thoughtfully. I wonder. It was an opportunity, his wife felt, for telling him about the boy. At first, he pooh-poohed the story, but he became thoughtful when she showed him the shadow. It is nobody I know, he said, examining it carefully, but it does look a scoundrel. We were still discussing it, you remember, says Mr. Darling, when Nana came in with Michael's medicine. You will never carry the bottle in your mouth again, Nana, and it is all my fault. Strong man though he was, there is no doubt that he had behaved rather foolishly over the medicine. If he had a weakness, it was for thinking that all his life he had taken medicine boldly And so now, when Michael dodged the spoon in Nana's mouth, he had said reprovingly, "Be a man, Michael." "Won't!" Michael cried naughtily. Mrs. Darling left the room to get a chocolate for him, and Mr. Darling thought this showed want of firmness. "Mother, don't pamper him," he called after her. "Michael, when I was your age, I took medicine without a murmur. I said, 'Thank you, kind parents, for giving me bottles to make me well.'" He really thought this was true, and Wendy, who was now in her nightgown, believed it also, and she said, to encourage Michael, "That medicine you sometimes take, Father, is much nastier, isn't it?" "Ever so much nastier," Mr. Darling said bravely, "and I would take it now as an example to you, Michael, if I hadn't lost the bottle." He had not exactly lost it. He had climbed in the dead of the night to the top of the wardrobe and hidden it there. What he did not know was that the faithful Liza had found it and put it back on his washstand. "I know where it is, Father," Wendy cried, always glad to be of service. "I'll bring it." And she was off before he could stop her. Immediately, his spirits sank in the strangest way. "John," he said, shuddering, "it's most beastly stuff. It's that nasty, sticky, sweet kind." "It will soon be over, Father," John said cheerily. And then in rushed Wendy with the medicine in a glass. "I've been as quick as I could," she panted. "You have been wonderfully quick," her father retorted with a vindictive politeness that was quite thrown away upon her. "Michael first," he said doggedly. "Father first," said Michael, who was of a suspicious nature. "I shall be sick, you know," Mr. Darling said threateningly. "Come on, Father," said John. "Hold your tongue, John," his father snapped out. Wendy was quite puzzled. "I thought you took it quite easily, Father." "That is not the point," he retorted. "The point is that there is more in my glass than in Michael's spoon." His proud heart was nearly bursting, "and it isn't fair. I would say it, though it were my last breath. It isn't fair." "Father, I am waiting," Michael said coldly. "It is all very well to say you are waiting. So am I waiting." "Father's a cowardly custard." "So are you a cowardly custard." "I'm not frightened." "Neither am I frightened." "Well, then, take it." Wendy had a splendid idea. Why not both take it at the same time? "Certainly," said Mr. Darling. "Are you ready, Michael?" Wendy gave the words. 1, 2, 3. And Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling slipped his behind his back. There was a yell of rage from Michael, and, "Oh, Father!" Wendy exclaimed. "What do you mean by, 'oh, Father'?" Mr. Darling demanded. "Stop that row, Michael. I meant to take mine, but I missed it." It was dreadful, the way all the three were looking at him, just as if they did not admire him. "Look here, all of you," he said entreatingly, as soon as Nana had gone into the bathroom. "I've just thought of a splendid joke. I shall pour my medicine into Nana's bowl, and she will drink it thinking it's milk. It was the color of milk, but the children did not have their father's sense of humor, and they looked at him reproachfully as he poured the medicine into Nana's bowl. "What fun!" he said doubtfully, and they did not dare expose him when Mrs. Darling and Nana returned. "Nana, good dog," he said, patting her. "I've put a little milk into your bowl, Nana." Nana wagged her tail, ran to the medicine, and began lapping it. Then she gave Mr. Darling such a look, not an angry look. She showed him the great red tear that makes us so sorry for noble dogs, and crept into her kennel. Mr. Darling was frightfully ashamed of himself, but he would not give in. In a horrid silence, Mrs. Darling smelt the bowl. "Oh, George," she said, "it's your medicine." "It was only a joke," he roared, while she comforted her boys, and Wendy hugged Nana. "Much good," he said bitterly. "My wearing myself to the bone, trying to be funny in this house." And still Wendy hugged Nana. "That's right," he shouted. "Coddle her. Nobody coddles me. Oh dear, no. I'm only the breadwinner. Why should I be coddled? Why? "George," Mrs. Darling entreated him, "not so loud. The servants will hear you." Somehow they had gotten into the way of calling Liza the servants. "Let them," he answered recklessly. "Bring in the whole world, but I refuse to allow that dog to lord it in my nursery for an hour longer." The children wept, and Nana ran to him beseechingly, but he waved her back. He felt he was a strong man again. In vain, he cried. "The proper place for you is the yard. And there you go to be tied up this instant." George, Mrs. Darling whispered, "remember what I told you about that boy." Alas, he would not listen. He was determined to show who was master in that house, and when commands would not draw Nana from the kennel, he lured her out of it with honeyed words, and seizing her roughly, dragged her from the nursery. He was ashamed of himself, and yet he did it. It was all owing to his too affectionate nature, which craved for admiration. When he had tied her up in the backyard, the wretched father went and sat in the passage with his knuckles to his eyes. In the meantime, Mrs. Darling had put the children to bed in unwonted silence and lit their nightlights. They could hear Nana barking, and John whispered, "It's because he is chaining her up in the yard." But Wendy was wiser. "That's not Nana's unhappy bark," she said, little guessing what was about to happen. "That is her bark when she smells danger." "Danger? Are you sure, Wendy?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Darling quivered and went to the window. It was securely fashioned. She looked out at the night. The night was peppered with stars. They were crowding round the house as if curious to see what was to take place there, but she did not notice this. Yet a nameless fear clutched at her heart and made her cry, "Oh, how I wish that I wasn't going to a party tonight." Even Michael, already half asleep, knew that she was perturbed, and he asked, "Can anything harm us, Mother, after the nightlights are lit?" "Nothing, precious," she said. "They are the eyes a mother leaves behind her to guard her children. She went from bed to bed, singing enchantments over them, and little Michael flung his arms round her. "Mother," he cried, "I'm glad of you." They were the last words she was to hear from him for a long time. Number 27 was only a few yards distant, but there had been a slight fall of snow, and Father and Mother Darling picked their way over it deftly, not to soil their shoes. They were already the only persons in the street, and all the stars were watching them. Stars are beautiful, but they may not take an active part in anything. They must just look on forever. It is a punishment put on them for something they did so long ago that no star now knows what it was. So the older ones have become glassy-eyed and seldom speak. Winking is the star language. But the little ones still wonder. They are not really friendly to Peter, who had a mischievous way of stealing up behind them and trying to blow them out. But they are so fond of fun that they were on his side tonight and anxious to get the grown-ups out of the way. So as soon as the door of 27 closed on Mr. and Mrs. Darling, there was a commotion in the firmament, and the smallest of all the stars in the Milky Way screamed out, "Now, Peter." So ends part 1. I love that story. I love this story. Yeah, so that's the thing about chapters 1 and 2. Like, all the adults so far, and Nana is definitely one of the adults, all the adults have regrets of how they comported themselves in what has happened so far. It's Mrs. Darling that demands that they go to a party 5 doors down. Mr. Darling was just absurd, an absurd baby about both his tie and taking medicine. Nana the dog even blamed herself for not pretending to like the medicine, because if she had pretended to like the medicine, then Mr. Darling would have, like, not taken her out and chained her up in the yard, right? And I cannot help but make obvious, maybe just to me, obvious comparisons between the way this story begins and Labyrinth. And if you don't know the movie Labyrinth, oh dear, watch it between now and the next episode. I beg you. So I'm going to just glance through the chat. I know. See, that's the thing, Amanda. Amanda Benjamin is. I'm ready to write off Mr. Darling forever. He's just like so obviously wrong, right? But no, they all have their regrets. They all think of themselves as the bad guy. We just kind of slightly disproportionately think of Mr. Darling as the bad guy here. So Nana doesn't speak the way that like Goofy speaks. The one thing that you'll notice as we go on in all this book is that Nana is clearly a sentient being, the same way that Jack London wrote dog characters. J.M. Barrie wrote Nana. Nana has a very human perspective, and it doesn't really matter if you or if you think that you are over anthropomorphizing Nana's reactions and her role in this. They all anthropomorphize Nana that way. Nana is really just that way. Nana is basically a human in a Newfoundland body. Nana is in every way both a dog and a person. Just stow that away. No, she doesn't speak English out loud the way Goofy or Donald Duck do. But she has very clear thoughts and intentions that are very much understood to the protagonists the same way that R2-D2 is understood by Luke Skywalker by, say, Return of the Jedi. I bet nobody in the sound of my voice doesn't understand that reference. So Nana never actually barks in English. Nana is just understood. Nice, Terry, with the... My will is as strong as yours, and my kingdom is as great. Oh, what's the next line? You have no power over me. Yeah, right. She always conveniently forgets that you have no power over me. Yes, Kathy B. Nana is a non-human person. Indeed. So it has been. We're at 10:15, but it has been multiple weeks since I have done an Ask Hunter Anything. So we're just going to keep plowing forward and look at a couple of questions here. So, two different people have coincidentally asked me variations on this same question. Jim from Ventura wrote this in an email, and pre-pandemic, somebody asked me this in a backyard party in Orange County in almost exactly the same words. But I thought I would address the question, do you think it is important to go to Mars, to colonize it? So, absolutely is my short answer. Absolutely. For a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is that on the long term, it's always important to back up your information, whatever that information is. In the case of the Library of Alexandria, had we had copies of all the books that had burned, all the scrolls, all the manuscripts, all the everything, if we had an external hard drive to back up the Library of Alexandria, it is frequently surmised that Homo sapien would be 1,000 years ahead of where we are currently. For good or for ill, that is just the cost to progress. And I'm going to take a slightly sideways dodge by comparative analogy. It's we have more on the surface of the earth. We have more at stake than what was just contained in the Library of Alexandria. We have all of biology in one thin little flimsy ecosystem, the biosphere, which is just a fraction of the depth of the earth, comparing the surface down to the core. What we need to do is get our eggs such that they are not all in the same basket. We need, I think, because of how comparatively often life-ending apocalyptic events such as the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, because of the simple frequency of such events, being here on Team People and Team Earth for that matter, I think we absolutely need to biodiversify to other ecosystems, to other planets. I don't know whether terraforming Mars is actually going to be feasible, but I definitely think that we should live there in some way. And not only there, but as many other places in the universe, let's keep it smaller than that, as many other places in the solar system as we possibly could, just to prepare for that one rainy, or more appropriately, fiery day that we didn't see coming, wherein life on Earth is no longer possible. If we had a colony on Mars, if we had colonies in space, if we had Rama-like O'Neill cylinders as envisioned by Arthur C. Clarke in Rendezvous with Rama, in which life could continue on other places rather than just the surface of the earth, it might be our obligation to the universe as a whole. Just this morning, I was listening to this fascinating conversation with an astrophysicist named Brian Cox. One of my favorite science podcasts is Answers with Joe. He had about an hour-long conversation with Brian Cox. And what I found refreshing about the conversation was as extremely sharp and intelligent and right on point that Brian Cox was. He said nothing that I didn't already agree with. It wasn't like new ideas. It was just stuff that I heard him say that was like, yeah, already with you there. And the most important bits of it were things like, why might humankind, why might Earth life be popular, be significant in the universe? And it might be that the universe would exist without us. Don't think for a moment that I am suggesting here that the universe needs humans to imagine it to be so. I think that's got causality all backwards. I don't endorse panpsychism, and I won't even bother to go into explaining what that is as just a sidebar. I don't think panpsychism is probably the valid way that the universe works. I think it is probably closer that purpose exists in the universe because it requires biological agents to perceive it. And just the operation of human beings, for example, perceiving purpose to the universe, that the universe then, in small aspects, a rock here, a sharpened stick there, a stream or an emptied out coconut, that these things actually do have purpose. Now, maybe I'm totally off base with this. Maybe purpose is completely meaningless except how human beings view it all. If that's the case, I will absolutely grant that I have no basis to stand with this assertion. But most of us live our lives either asking, what is my purpose? Or the more fortunate ones among us know their purpose and they doggedly pursue it until they can't anymore, or until it changes. So, whether purpose is real in the universe or not, purpose is real to human beings. And purpose being real to human beings who live in the universe, thus, make it real to the universe. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I think we will cut it off there. And let's see, is it the Panano Man tomorrow night? Yeah, David Benjamin's bi-weekly show will be on tomorrow night at 7:30. And of course, Amanda on Demanda, will be Wednesday at 7:30 on the Vaudacity Network. And I will see you all again for Lovecast 105, Thursday at 6 o'clock. Thank you all so much for joining us. I love you all. Keep thinking, keep reading, keep asking questions. And if you feel so inclined, toss something into the virtual tip jar. And as always, continue to throw questions into askhunteranything@gmail.com. Thank you all again. Good night.